The telegram arrived at 14:47. No one spoke when it was opened. The officer who read it first didn't move. He just stared at the paper, then folded it once, slowly, and passed it to the man beside him. It moved through the room like that, hand to hand, each person reading, each person going quiet. Outside, soldiers were celebrating. Somewhere in France, tanks were advancing. Radios crackled with coordinates and confirmations. But inside this room, there was only silence. Before we begin this story, please show some love by subscribing to the channel. It's quick, simple, and incredibly appreciated. Don't forget to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. The report reached the desk at the far end. George S. Patton picked it up. He read it once, then again. His jaw tightened. His eyes didn't move from the page. Erwin Rommel was dead. Not killed in combat, not captured, not executed publicly. Gone. Removed quietly, officially from wounds. Unofficially, by his own government. The room waited. Patton had spent years chasing Rommel's shadow across North Africa. He had studied every battle report, every decision, every risk Rommel took that should have failed, but didn't. The Allied command had built entire strategies around stopping one man, and now that man was gone. This should have been a victory, but no one in the room looked victorious. Patton set the paper down. He didn't smile. He didn't speak immediately. He just stared at the map on the wall, the one tracking German positions, the one that used to have Rommel's name circled in red. One officer cleared his throat. Another shifted his weight. They expected something, a joke maybe. Patton was known for those. Or a speech about destiny. About how the Allies were always going to win. Instead, Patton's voice came out low, almost flat. They didn't beat him. He paused. They broke him. The room froze. That wasn't the kind of thing you said about an enemy. Not in the middle of a war, not when men were still dying. But Patton wasn't finished. Patton looked at the wall, not at the men around him. His voice stayed calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, something bitter. A soldier should fall to another soldier, he said. Not to fear. One of the younger officers glanced at the door, like he wasn't sure he should be hearing this. Another looked down at his boots. Patton turned slightly, still holding the folded telegram. He deserved better than that. Silence. Someone finally spoke, carefully. Sir, he was the enemy. Patton didn't argue. He just nodded once, slowly, like he'd already considered that. He was, and he understood war better than most of the men giving him orders. He set the telegram on the desk. If I'd been born German. He stopped, let the sentence hang there. No one moved. I might have followed him. The words landed like a grenade with the pin still in. No one knew what to do with that. This wasn't grief. It wasn't sympathy. It was something stranger. Respect, recognition, and something darker. Something Patton didn't say out loud, but everyone in the room could feel. He wasn't mourning Rommel. He was mourning what happens to men like Rommel. Men who think too independently. Men who question orders when the mission doesn't make sense. Men who become problems for the people who need them. Patton turned back to the map. Get back to work, he said quietly. The room emptied, but the words stayed. Here's what no one understood in that moment. Patton wasn't just talking about Rommel. He was talking about himself. Because by the time Rommel died, Patton had already been sidelined once, publicly humiliated, pulled from command for slapping a soldier, for speaking too boldly, for being too useful in war and too dangerous in politics. Rommel had been forced to choose between a trial that would destroy his family or a quiet death dressed up as honor. Patton had been forced to apologize in front of his own men, to sit out the invasion of Normandy while others led the charge. Different methods, same message. Power doesn't kill men like this on the battlefield. It removes them when they stop being controllable. And standing in that room, holding a piece of paper that confirmed his greatest rival was gone, Patton understood something most men never see. The war wasn't the most dangerous part. Surviving it was. Before Rommel died, Allied intelligence had a problem. Not a tactical problem, not a logistical one, a psychological problem. There were German generals with more troops, generals with better equipment, generals who followed doctrine perfectly, but none of them occupied the same space in Allied planning that Rommel did. His name appeared in more briefings than it should have. Analysts tracked his movements even when he wasn't commanding active operations. Officers asked about him in meetings where he wasn't relevant. It wasn't rational. And that's what made it terrifying. One British intelligence officer wrote in a classified memo, "Rommel operates on tempo, not superiority. He moves before we finish planning. By the time we react, the terrain has already changed." That memo circulated for months, not because it was new information, because no one knew how to counter it. Speed isn't a tactic you can study and replicate. It's a state of mind. And Rommel had built an entire command philosophy around it. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He didn't build consensus. He didn't hesitate when the doctrine said to pause. He moved. And his enemies spent more time trying to predict him than fighting him. That's the part that haunted Allied planners. Even when Rommel wasn't present, they planned as if he was. Even when he was injured, reassigned, or pulled back to Germany, commanders still asked, what would Rommel do here? Fear doesn't require presence. It requires belief. And by 1944, the Allies believed Rommel could appear anywhere, any time, and turn a quiet sector into a disaster. So when the report came through that Rommel was dead, there should have been relief. Strategic advantage, one less variable. Room to breathe. But the room stayed quiet, because the fear didn't disappear with him. It had already spread, and the man who understood that better than anyone was about to make the same mistake the Germans once made. They were about to underestimate someone who thought like Rommel, someone who moved like him, someone the enemy was already starting to fear in exactly the same way. His name was Patton, and the Germans were about to realize they'd been preparing for the wrong threat. German intelligence didn't notice Patton all at once. He appeared in reports the way a storm builds. Slowly, then all at once. At first, he was just a name. An American general transferred to North Africa, aggressive, loud, prone to theatrics. Nothing unusual, but then the pattern started. A German reconnaissance unit reported unexpected movement near Gafsa. Tanks where there shouldn't be tanks. No build-up, no warning, just presence. A week later, another report. American forces advancing faster than their supply lines, overextended, vulnerable. Except they didn't collapse. They kept moving. One German analyst wrote in the margin of a field report, "This is not doctrine, this is instinct." That note got flagged, sent up the chain. By early 1943, Patton's name was appearing in German intelligence summaries 3 times a week. Not because he was winning every engagement, because he was unpredictable. And unpredictability, in war, is more dangerous than strength. The German command had spent years perfecting a system. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed and violence used to paralyze enemies before they could organize a response. It worked because most opponents were slow. They waited for orders, they hesitated, they needed certainty before they moved. Patton didn't. He attacked when the textbooks said to wait. He bypassed strong points instead of reducing them. He kept moving even when his flanks were exposed. It looked reckless. It wasn't. It was the same philosophy Rommel had used to terrorize British forces in North Africa, and the Germans recognized it immediately. One intelligence officer, a man who had served under Rommel, wrote a memo that circulated through Wehrmacht command. Patton does not react. He initiates. If we wait for him to make a mistake, we are already behind. That memo never reached Hitler. But it reached the field commanders, and they started preparing differently, not for the American army, for Patton. They repositioned reserves based on where they thought he might strike, not where doctrine said he should. They reinforced sectors he hadn't even looked at yet. They built contingency plans around his presence. And here's the part that changed everything. They were right to, because Patton wasn't following anyone's playbook. He was writing his own, and the Germans, who had spent years dominating, enemies with speed, suddenly found themselves on the other side of that equation, reacting instead of acting, guessing instead of knowing, afraid of what came next. That's when the fear started, and once it started, it didn't stop. By mid-1943, something strange was happening in German command rooms. Patton wasn't just being tracked. He was being studied. Field commanders requested copies of his battle reports, not to celebrate victories, but to understand how he thought. Intelligence analysts compared his movements to Rommel's. The similarities were uncomfortable. Both men used speed as a weapon. Both ignored doctrine when it slowed them down. Both created chaos in enemy planning by refusing to be predictable. But there was a difference. Rommel had operated in open desert, where speed and maneuver were natural advantages. Patton was doing it in Europe, in hedgerows, in mountains, in terrain that should have slowed him down. And it didn't. One German general, Friedrich von Mellenthin, who had served as Rommel's intelligence chief, wrote after the war, "Patton understood that hesitation is more costly than error. Most commanders fear mistakes. Patton feared stillness." That observation came too late to matter. But during the war, German officers were arriving at the same conclusion in real time, and it terrified them. Because if Patton operated the way Rommel did, then all the lessons they'd learned fighting Rommel applied in reverse. Don't wait for him to consolidate. Don't expect him to pause when logic says he should. Don't assume his risks are miscalculations. The problem was, knowing this didn't make it easier to stop. Fear became operational strategy. German commanders started pulling units back preemptively, not because Patton had attacked, but because they believed he might. They reinforced positions he hadn't targeted yet. They burned resources, defending against threats that didn't exist. That's the cost of fighting someone who moves faster than your decision cycle. You stop reacting to reality. You start reacting to possibility, and possibility is infinite. By the time the Allies began planning for the invasion of France, Patton had become something more than a general in German eyes. He had become an inevitability, a force they couldn't avoid, couldn't predict, couldn't outthink. And then, just when that fear was at its peak, Patton disappeared. In the spring of 1944, German intelligence noticed something unexpected. Patton's name stopped appearing in field reports. No sightings, no movements, no new deployments. At first, analysts assumed it was deception, that Patton was being hidden deliberately. But then the reports from occupied territories confirmed it. Patton had been removed from command, publicly disgraced, sent to England to command a phantom army, one that existed only on paper. The reason? He'd slapped a soldier, verbally abused men suffering from combat fatigue, made statements that embarrassed his superiors. The Allies had done what the Germans couldn't. They'd sidelined him. The relief in Wehrmacht headquarters was immediate. Patton had been the one variable no one could plan around, the one commander who forced them to constantly recalculate. And now he was gone. Resources that had been held in reserve, just in case Patton appeared, were reallocated. Defensive strategies were adjusted. Attention shifted to other threats. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, predictable men who followed process. For the first time in months, German planners felt like they were fighting a normal war again. But some officers weren't celebrating. Von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, issued a quiet order to his intelligence staff. Continue tracking Patton. Report any change in status immediately. His staff thought he was being paranoid. They were wrong. Because while Patton was sidelined, something stranger was happening. The Allies were using his absence as a weapon. They let German intelligence discover that Patton was in England. They let reconnaissance flights photograph fake tank formations near Dover. They let double agents report that Patton was preparing for an invasion at Calais. None of it was true, but the Germans believed it, because it made sense. If you wanted to invade Europe, you'd send your most aggressive general to lead it. And Patton, even disgraced, was still the most aggressive general the Allies had. So the Germans reinforced Calais. They kept entire divisions waiting for an invasion that was never coming. And when the real invasion hit Normandy on June 6, 1944, Patton was still in England, still commanding a fake army, still doing nothing. But his name alone had tied down German reserves. His reputation, built on speed and violence, had been turned into a strategic deception, and the Germans fell for it. Not because they were stupid, because they respected him. And respect in war can be weaponized. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Normandy was secured, the Allies were breaking out, and Patton, the man they'd been so relieved to see sidelined, was about to return, not to a quiet sector, not to a defensive position, to the front, where speed mattered most. Even after Normandy, Patton remained invisible. The Germans knew the invasion had succeeded. They knew Allied forces were pushing inland, but they didn't know where Patton was, and that not knowing became its own kind of paralysis. Field commanders sent requests up the chain. Confirm Patton's location. Is he in Normandy? Which sector is he commanding? Intelligence couldn't answer, because Patton was still in England, still commanding the fake 1st U.S. Army Group. Still part of the deception, but the German High Command didn't believe that. They assumed he'd been quietly inserted into the real fight. So they started planning as if he was already there. Reserves were shifted. Defensive lines were reinforced. Units that should have been committed to stopping the Normandy breakout were held back, just in case Patton appeared somewhere else. This is what fear does. It doesn't just make you react to threats. It makes you react to ghosts. One panzer commander later admitted, "We defended against two enemies, the Allies we could see, and Patton, who we couldn't." And while they defended against a man who wasn't even present, the real Allied forces kept advancing. Slowly, carefully, too carefully in Patton's opinion. Because while he sat in England, watching the battle reports come in, he could see what the Germans couldn't. The breakout from Normandy was succeeding, but it was sluggish, methodical. Montgomery and Bradley were advancing according to plan, phase lines, supply depots, consolidation before movement. It was working, but it was slow. And slow, Patton knew, gave the enemy time to recover, time to reposition, time to rebuild defenses. He sent messages to Eisenhower, to Bradley. "Let me go. Put me in the field. I can move faster than they can react." For weeks, the answer was no. The deception was still working. German forces were still pinned at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Patton's invisibility was worth more than his presence, but there's a limit to how long you can fight a ghost. Eventually, the Germans pulled units from Calais. Eventually, they stopped waiting, and when they did, Eisenhower made the call. Patton was going in, not to a quiet sector, not to a support role, to the spearhead, Third Army, full command, operational freedom. The Germans found out 3 days after he arrived, and by then, it was already too late. Patton took command of Third Army on August 1, 1944. Within 72 hours, German intelligence knew. Within a week, their defensive plans were collapsing. Third Army didn't advance the way other Allied forces had. There was no pause, no consolidation, no careful build-up of supply lines before movement. Patton just moved. His forces punched through the German lines at Avranches and didn't stop. Not to secure the flanks, not to wait for reinforcements. They kept going, south into Brittany, east toward the Seine, faster than German commanders could reposition. Within 2 weeks, Third Army had covered more ground than any Allied force since D-Day. But distance wasn't the problem. Speed was. German doctrine had always relied on time. Time to identify a threat, time to move reserves, time to establish new defensive lines. Patton didn't give them time. He moved faster than their decision cycle. By the time German command identified where he was already somewhere else. One Wehrmacht report from mid-August. Third Army movements no longer follow predictable patterns. Patton is not advancing toward strategic objectives. He is advancing toward momentum. That sentence, buried in a situation report, captured the entire problem. Most generals fought for territory. Patton fought for tempo, and tempo, once established, is almost impossible to stop. German units found themselves retreating not because they'd been defeated, but because staying in place meant being surrounded. Supply lines collapsed. Communication broke down. Entire divisions were cut off, not by overwhelming force, by speed. By the time a German commander requested permission to withdraw, Patton's forces were already behind him. Von Rundstedt, watching the reports come in, reportedly said, "He doesn't fight us. He outruns us." It wasn't a compliment. It was a surrender to inevitability, because there was no counter-doctrine for this, no manual that explained how to stop an enemy who moved faster than you could think. The only option was retreat, and retreat under Patton turned into rout. By September, Third Army had liberated more French territory than any other Allied force. Not because they fought harder, because they moved faster. And the Germans, who had once used that same philosophy to terrorize Europe, were now on the receiving end. That's what Patton had understood all along. That's what Rommel had understood. War isn't won by the side with better plans. It's won by the side that moves while the other side is still planning. And by the time the Germans realized that, they'd already lost. After the war, German officers were interviewed, debriefed, asked to explain what went wrong. Most talked about logistics, air superiority, the numbers, but when they talked about individual commanders, one name came up more than any other. Patton, not Eisenhower, not Montgomery. Patton. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to multiple commanders in the West, said, "Patton was the most dangerous opponent we faced, not because he was reckless, because he understood what we feared most." Another officer, General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, wrote in his memoir, "We studied Patton the way we once studied Rommel. Both men operated on instinct, both refused to wait, and both made hesitation the enemy's greatest weakness." That comparison wasn't accidental. By the end of the war, German officers openly admitted that Patton had done to them what Rommel had done to the British. Used speed to break their decision-making, forced them to react instead of plan, turned their own doctrine against them, but here's what they didn't understand at the time. Patton had studied Rommel, read his reports, analyzed his battles, understood his philosophy. And when Rommel died, Patton didn't just mourn a rival. He mourned the loss of the only other commander who understood what war really was. Not strategy, not logistics. Tempo. One German general, asked after the war if there was any way they could have stopped Patton, said, "We stopped him once when the Allies ran out of fuel." That's it. Not tactics, not counterattacks, not better intelligence. They stopped him when his tanks ran out of gas. That's how you beat someone who fights the way Patton did. You don't outthink them. You hope they run out of resources before you run out of space. And even then, it's temporary. Because the moment Patton got fuel again, he started moving. The Germans knew this, and by late 1944, they'd stopped trying to stop him. They just tried to survive him. That's the highest compliment an enemy can give. Not fear, resignation. When Patton stood in that quiet room, holding the report of Rommel's death, he wasn't thinking about tactics. He was thinking about cost. Rommel hadn't died in battle. He'd been forced to choose between a public trial, one that would destroy his family, and a private death dressed up as honor. He chose the latter, quietly, without resistance, because that's what happens when the system decides you're no longer useful. Patton understood that better than anyone. He'd already been sidelined once, humiliated, made to apologize in front of his own men for behavior that, in his mind, was just part of leadership. He'd been too loud, too independent, too willing to question orders when they didn't make sense. And for that, he was punished, not by the enemy, by his own side. Rommel faced the same thing after Normandy, after the July 20th plot, after he'd quietly suggested that Germany negotiate peace. The Nazi regime decided he was a liability, not because he'd betrayed them, because he'd stopped being controllable. That's the part Patton saw when he read the report, not the death of an enemy. The reminder that systems, any system, eventually remove the people who can't be controlled, even if those people are the best at what they do, especially if they are. Because competence without loyalty is dangerous. Independence without obedience is a threat. And men like Patton and Rommel, men who thought for themselves, who ignored doctrine when it didn't work, who moved faster than their superiors were comfortable with, were always going to be problems. Patton survived the war, but just barely. After Germany surrendered, he was sent to Bavaria to govern a defeated population. He spoke too freely, compared Nazi party members to American political parties, suggested that some former Nazis should be retained in administrative roles because they knew how to run things. It was practical, it was logical, and it got him fired, reassigned, sent to a meaningless position. A few months later, he died in a car accident. Some people still wonder if it was really an accident. Most historians think it was. But the fact that people wonder tells you everything you need to know about what happens to men like Patton. They don't retire. They don't fade away. They get removed, one way or another. Rommel knew that. Patton knew that. And standing in that command room in October 1944, holding a piece of paper that said Rommel was gone, Patton understood exactly what he was looking at. Not a victory, a mirror. Because the saddest truth about war isn't what it does to enemies. It's what it does to the men who understand it too well. The battlefield rewards boldness. Politics punishes it, and when the war ends, the men who are too dangerous to ignore become too dangerous to keep. Rommel was silenced by his own government. Patton was silenced by history. Both of them understood war better than the men who gave them orders, and both of them paid for it. That's what Patton meant when he said, "They didn't beat him, they broke him." He wasn't talking about the Allies. He was talking about power and what it does to the people who refuse to serve it quietly. If you stayed this long, you already know this isn't a history channel. It's a power analysis channel. And if you understand why Patton's words were sad, not just surprising, then you're ready for what comes next. Because the next story isn't about war. It's about what happens when the most dangerous people in a system realize they're expendable, and how some of them fight back.